Okay, so today I want to speak a little bit about the concept of the books of the Nevi'im. And, you know, it's a funny thing. When people learn Nevi'im, so they tend to learn the books of Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, and Malachim, because those are historical books. Once we get to Yeshayahu, Yecheskel, Yirmiyahu, they're much harder to learn. But in point of fact, in terms of understanding the nature of the book, the historical books are quite difficult to understand because they don't seem to be Nevuah. So I'm first going to start with the pure prophetic books, and then we'll try to work backwards. So let's take, three of the biggest prophets, the ones that are best known, the book of Yeshayahu, Isaiah, Yirmiyahu, and Yecheskel. Right? These are books of prophecy. They are mainly not books of history. So how does it work? So there's such a thing as prophecy. The Torah itself says that Hashem will give us a gift of prophecy in order that we will not turn to the stars or the astrologers or the superstitions. And prophecy was a gift, as I had mentioned. The Gemara in Megillah tells us there are 48 male prophets that are mentioned in Tanakh and 7 female prophetesses. But in reality, there were either 600,000 or some say double 600,000 prophets. But the concept is the 48 and the 7, the 55 prophets, are the prophecies that have eternal value. Nevuah, shetzricha l'doros. So what is the nature of the prophetic state? So the Rambam is masber that the prophetic state is that the prophet kind of goes into a trance, goes into a swoon. Either it's a dream while he's asleep, or even when he's awake, he kind of loses awareness of where he is. He loses his sensory functions, and he's consumed with prophetic vision and images. This was the uniqueness of Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy, that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to be fully awake, fully conscious, and could talk to God in a conversational way. Most prophets, they kind of have a weakness, they swoon, they faint, and they go into a trance. Okay, Beseder. And God gives them prophecies. Now, how does, once he's in the prophetic state, and he gets what is called Nevuah, what does he experience? Does God give him exact words? Just like Moshe, God says, you shall tell the Jewish people this message. Or does a prophet see images, pictures, visions, which he then puts into his own words? Meaning, is Nevuah verbal? I mean, obviously there are images. There's no question that Nevuah has images, because in Nevuos there are images. Whether it's the Kisei HaKavod of Yecheskel or many, many other visions. But the question is, when the pasuk then says, and God told the Navi this, or God told me this, does that mean the Navi heard it? Or does that mean the Navi is now describing his experiences by putting it into his own words? In other words, the question I'm asking is Nevi'im different than Torah? In the Torah, Moshe put nothing in his own words except the book of Devarim, which God then said to write down. But Moshe Rabbeinu is giving the exact words of Hashem. Is a Navi giving the exact words of Hashem? Or is the Navi putting his visions into words? Now there is a klal, the Gemara says, that often Nevi'im talk about the same things in different ways. So Yirmiyahu will talk about the same Averos as Yeshayahu, and they'll talk about it in different ways. And the language of the Gemara is, Ein Shnei Nevi'im Misnavim Besignain Echad. Two different prophets do not prophesy in the same way. Every Navi has their own style. So what does that statement mean? Every Navi prophesies in their own style. So one interpretation is Nevi'im get visions, and they put their nevuah in their own words. So Yeshayahu will put it one way, Yirmiyahu will put it one way, Yechezkel will put it one way. In other words, that's quite literally what the Maimer Chazal is, that the words are not from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The words are the Navi's own words based on the visions that the Navi received. And that's why different Nevi'im will say it in different ways. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation would be that the Navi actually hears the words. The Navi hears the words of God. And the Navi is reproducing the words of God. But what Hashem causes him to hear is based on his personality. In other words, Ein Shnei Nevi'im Misnavim B'Sigin Echad doesn't mean the Navi makes up the words, but the words that he hears is based on the shirish of his neshama. So this is actually a very important question, meaning to say, does a Navi hear the exact words of his prophecy? Or does the Navi put the prophecy in his words based on his interpretation of the vision? Or maybe it's a mix, because sometimes Nevuos begin with the words, Kayamar Hashem, so says God. Other times Nevuos don't begin with Kayamar Hashem. So there is a possibility that the Kayamar Hashem Nevuos are the exact words of God that the Navi hears. Other Nevuos that don't have the Kayamar Hashem might be the Navi paraphrasing the Dvar Hashem based on the visions that the Navi saw, and that would be the first meaning of Ein Shnei Nevi'im Misnavnim B'Sigin Echad. And the point basically is that the Navi receiving the word of Hashem might be very different than Moshe Rabbeinu receiving the word of Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu receives precise words that he gives over. By Nevi'im, we're a little less certain. Perhaps he gets the exact words. Perhaps he only has visions that he puts into his own words. Or perhaps, yesh v'yesh, the Kohamar Hashem prophecies are the direct words of Hashem that he hears. The not Kohamar Hashem are the Navi putting it into his own words. Okay? Again, I am not giving you a final HaRav on this. It's just different possibilities to be aware of. Now, the Navi, however, is commanded to communicate his nevuos to the people. Most of the time to the Jewish people, 99.9% of the time. In very rare cases, the Navi is commanded to communicate his nevuah to the Goyim, such as the book of Yonah, where Yonah is commanded to go to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, to tell them to do tshuva. So this is very important. The essence of a Navi is not only the nevuah that he gets, but the commandment to communicate that nevuah to a group of people. So this would answer a very simple question. We know that, let's say, Yeshayahu is in the Nevi'im. We know the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is in the Ketuvim. The book of Daniel is not in the Nevi'im. And indeed, the Gemara in Megillah says beferish that Daniel is not among the 48 Nevi'im of Nach. Daniel is not a Navi. Now the question is this. In the book of Daniel, Daniel has many visions. And Daniel has visions about the future, about when Mashiach is going to come. In fact, the whole Messianic calculation you could build on the book of Daniel. Although we obviously don't know how all of that works. So did Daniel see the future? He obviously did. So if the definition of a prophet is someone to whom Hashem shows the future, in what possible way was Daniel not a prophet? How could Daniel not be counted as a Navi? Why is his book not in the books of Nevuah? And the short answer is, what makes you a Navi is not simply what you see. What makes you a Navi is the commandment to go communicate what you see. Daniel was given no commandment to communicate his vision. In fact, that's why the word Navi comes from Niv Sifasayim. Niv Sefasayim means pronunciation, articulation. What makes you a Navi is you're given a mission to communicate your Nevuah. He who has visions, even if they're from God, he who is given insight into the future, even if it's from Hashem, it's not magic, it's not superstition, it is a vision from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, in a sense, he has gone through the prophetic experience. He has experienced what we would call Nevuah, in the sense of that connection to God. But he's not a Navi, and that's why Daniel is not a Navi. He was not given any obligation to communicate that mission. So, the Nevi'im were given the obligation to communicate, and their obligation to communicate was oral. Remember, all of the Nevuos are oral Nevuos that are said orally. Hashem basically says, go and tell the people. That's why it sometimes helps, just a technique, when you're learning Nach, to read it as a speech, like as if, Lahavdil, you were a Shakespearean actor. You had to say it, right? And Nevuah is a very dramatic thing. The Navi is addressing crowds of people. Sometimes there's opposition. Sometimes people will insult him. They will throw stones at him. They will even threaten his life. But the Navi has to be fearless in giving over the will of Hashem. But once again, as I said a few moments ago, whether these are the exact words of Hashem, or whether they are the Navi's own words in terms of what Hashem showed him, that's going to be a machlokas, right? It's not so clear. It's not like Moshe Rabbeinu, who is giving the exact words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rather, the Navi may see pictures and images and visions in which he understands he is supposed to give that vision. Yeah?
If it is the Navi's own words,
Yep.
does that leave room for Hashash that the Navi's saying things wrong or putting things wrong?
Yeah, so one thing is interesting. The Derech Hashem writes that it is possible that a Navi does not fully understand his Nevuah, but he won't get it wrong, meaning to say, everything he will communicate will be accurate, but he may not understand the full repercussions of what he's communicating. So if a Navi is talking about Acharit Hayamim, the Messianic era, he will say truthfully what Hashem has showed him, but he may not fully understand it either, because there are repercussions that it may be beyond him. Yeah.
What about when Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron, and when he only spoke to Aaron?
Our assumption is, once again, although it's not clear, because you are right, the interesting point is, Moshe has the uniqueness of a special type of nevuah that nobody else had. He didn't go into a swoon, he didn't lose consciousness. So the interesting question is, when Hashem speaks to Moshe and Aaron, or Hashem speaks to Aaron, did Aaron partake of the madrega of Moshe? So really it's Moshe and Aaron, or was Aaron like any other Navi who went into trances and the like? I don't know, but all I can say is the simple meaning of the psukim in Baloscha is Aaron himself went into the trance, because after all, that's what Hashem is saying. Hashem is giving Musar to Miriam and Aaron by comparing them to Moshe, who has a special prophetic revelation. Mashma, that even they did not have that special prophetic revelation. Now maybe, I don't know, I'll look into it, when Hashem is talking to Moshe and Aaron together, so maybe Aaron gets schlepped in because of his association with Moshe. But it's a good, interesting question. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, though, is this. Who told the Navi to write down the words? In other words, there seem to be two levels here. You're a Navi. Hashem gives you a message, either by words or by pictures or by both, to communicate orally to a given audience. You went ahead and you did your job. You made your speech, you communicated, you gave musar, you gave tochacha, you gave predictions, all of these things. But then we have a book. Eventually these prophecies are in a book. Was the Navi commanded to write the book? In other words, how do you go from the commandment to give nevuah to the commandment, not to the commandment, to the existence of a book that we read ledorot, forever. Because in truth, you don't find a direct prophetic command to write things down. I mean, very rarely you do, but 90%, well over 90% of the Nevuas, Hashem didn't say, write this down in a sefer. So the question is, how do you get from prophecy to written book of prophecy? So once again, surprisingly, there's some uncertainty here. Some say that the prophecies came from Hashem, and even if they're God's exact words, the kesiva of the prophecy was the Navi's own decision. Hashem did not command him to write it down. The Navi made a record of his prophecy. And since the Chachamim determined that this was a prophecy that was needed l'doros, and probably that's the Navi himself wrote it down for that reason, it became canonized. But there was no tzivoy al pi Hashem to write it down. The Abarbanel, however, and this is probably the mainstream understanding, is that somehow, and the question is, where do you find it? There's no pasuk. Somehow, nichlal in the prophetic mission was the commandment to write it down based on the rule that nevuos that are needed for eternity should be written down. Which means there are two different levels of prophecy here. There is the prophecy that gives the Navi the message, and then there's the prophecy that tells him to write it down. But then, see, the more you think about this, the more crazy you get, because there's like infinite possibilities. Did the prophet write down his prophecies in a state of prophecy or in a state of recollection? Meaning, let's imagine, you were a Navi. Hashem put you in a state of Nevuah. You got messages. You communicated those messages. And you understand, let's say from Hashem, you're supposed to write down those messages. So you sit down and you write them down. When you're writing them down, are you in a state of prophecy? Or are you in a state of recollecting your earlier state of prophecy? But you're not a prophet. You're like a person writing his memoirs. I'm writing what I did. And that happens to include prophetic revelations. So the Abarbanel again assumes that it's not just the getting of the prophecy that was from Hashem, but your writing. First of all, it's hard for me to understand exactly, given the fact that prophecy means you lose control of your body, it's hard for me to actually understand how you can write in a prophetic state. I mean, it's almost a contradiction there, but okay. But putting that logistical problem aside, the Abarbanel is mashma that nevuos are also dictations by Hashem in the writing of it. Meaning, that's like the Torah. God is telling the Navi what to write, or at least showing the Navi images what to write. Meaning, so according to this, there's nevuah that occurs at two different stages, and maybe they're not identical. Maybe what the Navi said may not be exactly what Hashem said to write down. Because these are two different prophetic experiences. One is the prophetic experience of what I should say, and then comes the prophetic instruction as to what I should write. And me'ezatam sheyeh, maybe Hashem wanted it written in one way, which was a little different than the way it was said. But the point is, the Abarbanel says, it is not only the oral nevuah that is al pi Hashem, but it's even the written nevuah. Now, see, this explains a certain anomaly. If you look at, let's say, the book of Yirmiyahu or Yeshayahu, there are prophecies. But in between the prophecies are what might be called editorial comments. It might say, in the 30th year of Yoshio, Hashem appeared to Yirmiyahu this way. And sometimes there's even historical narratives. For example, the end of the book of Yirmiyahu describes the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. In the book of Yeshayahu, there are descriptions of Chizkiyahu HaMelech getting sick because he didn't want children. Meaning there's plenty of things in the books of prophecy that are history or editorial transitions. Is that from God? In other words, who wrote that? Is that prophecy? So it all depends on how you understand it. If we understand that the only thing that's nevuah is what the Navi was told by Hashem to tell Bnei Yisrael, and then the Navi on his own recollected his prophetic experiences, it would actually turn out that the history and the transitions are not in themselves nevuah. They are simply the Navi in his memoirs recounting his nevuah adds historical events to it. On the other hand, if we follow the Abarbanel, which again may be the mainstream position, that it's not just the getting of the prophecy that was from Hashem, but it is the writing of the prophecy that's from Hashem. Hashem determined in a prophetic state that the Navi should write down these historical events, like Chizkiyahu HaMelech in the book of Yeshayahu and the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Okay, are you following here? Now, this is why we would otherwise have a problem with the first 4 books of Nevi'im. The first 4 books of Nevi'im, which are the most widely studied because they are easier books to learn, the book of Yoshua, the book of Shoftim, the book of Shmuel, remember Aleph and Beis are considered one book in Chazal, the book of Malachim. These books, by and large, do not contain prophecies, although there are some prophecies. These books are historical descriptions of what happened to the Jewish people, basically from the time they entered Eretz Yisrael after Moshe Rabbeinu's death until the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Beginning of Yoshua, we cross the Yarden. The end of Malachim Beis is Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Okay? These are 4 books. Now, they're not books of prophecy. They're not books that talk about future events and everything else. These are books of history. So, in what way are they Nevi'im? Why are they called Nevi'im? So, the only way it makes sense is with the Abarbanel, that even though they're historical, they were written down by prophets who were acting in the state of prophecy, writing the history in the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated that history to be written, like the Torah, which has historical events. In other words, what I'm saying is, if you were to learn the other way, that it's only the Nevuos that are Nevuos, and the history is the Navi's memoirs, then you literally would have no explanation for the historical books, because that would mean the historical books, even if they were written by a Navi, would just be a memoir. So what makes it Nevuah? The answer has to be, like the Abarbanel, that the Etzem Kesiva was Alpi Nevuah. And therefore, even if there's no Nevuos in the content of the books were written under the prophetic inspiration of Nevuah. Now again, I realize that with all of the complications, I'm probably bringing you back to what you thought anyway. This is probably, I think maybe the average person actually thinks, yeah, God dictated the Nevi'im, and that's actually where we're coming out. But all I'm saying is it's not, intrinsically it is not so pashut, because there is nowhere in the Nevi'im where it says Hashem told the Navi to write down his Nevuos, except in some isolated instances. So the whole mystery of who told the Navi to write it down and was the writing done in a prophetic inspiration is not so pashut. But on the other hand, it is the only way you can understand Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim. In what way are they books of Nevuah, except for the fact that they were written under divine Nevuah inspiration, and Hashem therefore dictated how the history should be recounted, and that makes it Nevuah. That makes it Nevuah. It's not Nevuah in the sense of telling the future, but it's Nevuah in the sense of divine revelation as to how something should be written down. Okay. Yeah.
Didn't some of them Nevi'im scribe?
Say again?
Didn't some of the Nevi'im scribe?
Yeah, sure. Yirmiyahu had a scribe, sure. So you are correct. The book of Eicha, for example, was written, Baruch ben Uriah was his scribe. But we'll talk about that. But that wasn't Al Pi Hashem necessarily. Yeah, he had his private scribes. In fact, this may explain an interesting thing. In Divrei Hayamim, I should make a list of this. There's all sorts of Nevi'im who had their own books. And the Pasuk will say in Divrei Hayamim, more details about this king can be found in the book of Ido Hanavi. Now, we don't have a book of Ido Hanavi. Why don't we have a book? Part of it would be this, that if you understand that the books of Nevi'im were written al Pi Hashem, there may be many Nevi'im who also wrote books, and they were Nevi'im. They were Nevi'im Mamish. But the Kesiva was not al Pi Hashem. Meaning, if the Navi is simply writing a memoir, it's like a good Musar Sefer. It's like Mesilas Yesharim. But it doesn't have the status of a book of Nevuah. In other words, in order to be a book of Nevuah, it's not enough that it contains Nevuah, but the Etzem Kesiva has to be al Pi Hashem. And it could be all of those other books are books of Nevuos. But the Kesiva was not, Hashem didn't say to write it down. You see? So, and that's why there are many, in Divrei Hayamim it mentions all sorts of Nevi'im that had books. And, we don't have. Yeah.
Should we approach it in the same way as to say maybe they wrote it section by section or all at once?
So that's a good question. That I honestly don't know. I mean, meaning we have no hechrich one way or the other. Perhaps they wrote it in sections. Perhaps they wrote it not. But either way, I think would be acceptable. But the Iker question is, was the Etzem writing al Pi Hashem, or was it just a memoir of a pre-existing Nevuah? Now, let's now go to Ketuvim. There is a third section that we call the writings. Tehillim, Iyov, Mishlei, the 5 Megillos, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Okay? So the question becomes, what is the difference between Nevi'im and Ketuvim? Now, one answer, you might say, is, well, there is a difference between Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh, although we're not really sensitive to those differences. Nevuah is a certain elevated state of connection to Hashem. Ruach HaKodesh is an inspired holy state, but it doesn't reach the level of Nevuah. So a simple distinction would be that the Nevi'im are books written by Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim are people of Balei Ruach HaKodesh, not Nevuah, so David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech. But there are a few problems with this. First of all, it's very clear that David HaMelech and Shlomo are both counted as Nevi'im. And second of all, let's take Eicha. The author of Eicha is Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu Hanavi was obviously a Navi. He has Sefer Yirmiyahu. So you have two books written by the same person. One book is in Nevi'im, and one book is in Ketuvim. So one possibility is, he wrote the books under different levels of divine inspiration. Yirmiyahu sometimes had Nevuah, and sometimes had only Ruach HaKodesh. So the same person, when he writes in a state of nevuah, it's nevuah. When he writes in a state of ruach hakodesh, it's Ketuvim. Right? So one distinction. Now, why that would be so? Why would Eicha be? Well, actually, I can give you a possible reason. There is a concept that nevuah requires that you be mitaych simcha. Eicha wasn't shaykh such a thing. So ruach hakodesh, maybe he was able to get. The complete simcha wasn't shaykh. Okay, beseder. But that's an interesting point. The same person can have a book in Nevi'im and can have a book in Ketuvim. So that's one distinction. Nevuah versus Ruach HaKodesh. There's another distinction, which is what I said before about Daniel. Nevi'im have a mission to communicate. The Ketuvim, there was no command to communicate. So David wrote Tehillim, Shlomo wrote Mishlei. They were not commanded by Hashem to communicate these teachings, but they thought it would be a good idea. So distinction number one is Nevuah versus Ruach HaKodesh. Distinction number two is Chiyuv to communicate from Hashem versus not Chiyuv to communicate. And by the way, that would explain Eicha as well. Hashem didn't command Yirmiyahu to give the Tochacha of Eicha. This is Yirmiyahu's decision, again based on Ruach HaKodesh and the like. And in fact, one might even say that there wasn't even a command to write it down. Not only in the Ketuvim were they not commanded to orally communicate anything, they weren't even told to write the book. Daniel was not told to write things down. David HaMelech was not told to write things down. In other words, there was no tzivoy bichlal to communicate. So these are books of Ruach HaKodesh, but they're not books of Nevuah. In some cases, they were not Nevi'im, like Daniel. In some cases, they were Nevi'im, but these particular books came to them by Ruach HaKodesh, and they were not commanded to communicate that vision. Okay, so that's kind of the differences between Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Now, again, there are a lot of problems here, and unfortunately, it's actually very hard to find even Makairis that talk about this at any length. The best Makor is Abarbanel. The Abarbanel wrote a huge commentary on Nevi'im and Sefer Daniel and Ketuvim, and in his Hakdama to Sefer Yehoshua is really his Hakdama on Nach. So with the Abarbanel, you have the opposite problem. I just said you can't find people who address things at length. The Abarbanel addresses things at tremendous length, and the Abarbanel is so marich that it's actually very, very hard to get through it. Somebody did make a Kitzur Abarbanel like a few hundred years ago, which I don't have access to. I'm going to try to find it because the Abarbanel is very, very marich. But the Abarbanel does make the point that his chiddush is that every word in the Nevi'im, even in the writing, is dictated by Hashem, and that was not true with the Ketuvim. The Ketuvim were written with the Gedor of Ruach HaKodesh, therefore they are the person's own words, and there also was no command to even communicate them. Okay, so that's kind of the difference of what makes Nevi'im, what makes Ketuvim, and why the same person, can, like Yirmiyahu, can have a book in Ketuvim and can have a book in Nevi'im at the same time. Okay, are there any questions about that? Yeah.
Once these things were written down, how do they get to us?
Yeah, so once they were written down, so they were preserved. There was a Messiah that whichever Chachamim validated them, they were preserved. Now, in truth, they were preserved with other books that people were thinking might be kadosh, like the Apocrypha and the like. But at some point in time, by Rabbi Akiva's time, which is already after the Churban, the final decisions were made. The initial decisions were the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. Apparently, they did not decide every single issue. Shir Hashir and Koheles were not included until later, or at least there was a machlokus about including it until Rabbi Akiva's time and the like. Okay, so this is yeah.
Why don't we have Nevi'im today?
Why don't we have Nevi'im today? Yeah, so the Gemara says that we lost Nevuah at the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. That was one of the things that was taken away from us. Ad Kedei Kach, that the Gemara in Bava Basra says, anyone who claims to be a Navi today is either a shaita, a fool, or a katan, or a child. And Nevuah is a certain level of closeness to Hashem, where when you don't have a Beis HaMikdash, and even in this Bayis Sheni, which wasn't the same in its holiness, we don't merit to have. Now, the Rambam says that one of the things that will happen when Mashiach comes is the restoration of Nevuah. That's going to be the gift. That's the meaning of the pasuk in Yoel, other Nevi'im. Hashem will pour eshpoches ruchi. That's the expression. I will pour my spirit over you, and we will have Nevuah. Now, Rav Kook, who is a very, very mystical person, and Rav Kook had written different diaries to himself, not intended for publication, that for 50, 60, 70 years after his death, nobody touched. They were kept in a safe in Merkaz HaRav. Nobody was allowed to look at. But apparently somebody broke into the Mitzvah Babi Avera. Somebody broke into the safe, and somebody published these secret journals of Rav Kook. And what emerges, again, we're not in a position to judge, is Rav Kook felt that we're close enough to the Messianic age. And this is back in the 30s or earlier, that through proper meditation and proper exercises, we would be able to be Zeicha to a Madrega of Nevuah. And Rav Kook apparently was trying to achieve that type of state. Did he achieve it? Again, also little hints there that are not so clear in this area. But there are Yechidei Skula who actually feel that the Gemara's rule that there can't be Nevuah in the world may not apply in our Tekufa, which is Zikva de Mashiach. So there are people who are mishtadel to put themselves in prophetic trances through Kabbalah and the like. So far, are they Nevi'im? I wouldn't say. Chabad makes the claim that the Rebbe was a Navi. They actually say, okay, since he was a Navi and he said he was Mashiach, Memela, you're Mechuyev, the Torah obligates you to listen to what a Navi tells you. First of all, I'm not sure if that even applies to a statement. A Navi tells you, I'm Mashiach. I'm not sure that qualifies as Nevuah. But I'm not going to address this issue. Was the Rebbe a Navi? Did he say, today is Gimel, today is the yard site, right? Wow, it's amazing that this thought comes into my head on the yard site. So I don't want to get into this because it's controversial. There's so much we don't understand. But there are intimations that there may be the possibility of Nevuah Bisman Hazeh. Yeah.
Who wrote the history books?
Yeah, so the Gemara says, the Gemara in Bava Basra actually gives us exact authorship. It says Yoshua wrote Sefer Yoshua. Shmuel Hanavi wrote Shoftim, and Shmuel Hanavi also wrote the books of Shmuel until his death. And after his death, there were two other Nevi'im, Gad HaChoza, Gad the seer, and Nasan Hanavi. The book of Malachim was written by Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu Hanavi wrote the book of Malachim. Now it's interesting, Shmuel Hanavi also wrote the book of Rus. This is another example. Just like Yirmiyahu has a book in Nevi'im and a book in Ketuvim, Shmuel Hanavi, right? He has Shoftim and most of Shmuel, which is in Nevi'im, and he has Megillas Rus in Ketuvim, right? Interestingly enough, right? Megillas Rus was his private project to show the yichus of David HaMelech. It was not a nevuah that Hashem commanded him to write the book, but it was written under Ruach HaKodesh. Yeah.
Going off of the previous question, with losing nevuah, does that have anything to do with praying away the HaRav or Zara as well?
Yes, it is actually connected in a very deep way. because they occurred at virtually the same time. And the getter is that when we lost the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, that means we lost a certain spiritual intimacy with Hashem, because the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah comes from the fact that we are so overwhelmed with divinity that we feel we're not worthy to talk to God, so we have to go to subordinates. So that led us to a bad place. So in order to take away the Yetzer Hara, Hashem had to make us less sensitive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that way I'm not afraid to daven. Right? I'm not afraid. And therefore I don't have to turn to idols. I can go to God directly. But by taking away that intimacy, we no longer had the kayach of nevuah. So it's an amazing thing. It's like a lobotomy. When you cut out part of the brain because the person is in danger of seizures, so Baruch Hashem, you've gotten rid of the seizures, but you've also taken something good out of it as well. Losing the Yitzra, the Avodah Zarah, resulted in losing nevuah. 100% correct. The Vilna Gaon makes that point. We lost two things at the same time. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop here. We're good.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.